Everyone. Welcome back to our EduFuturism learning series. It's great to see y'all here. We appreciate you being here. Before we get started, I wanted to thank our supporters who makes events like this possible, three of whom are Carrie Porter, Gamal Sharif, and Wendy Fayron. To support Human Restoration Project and our event guests, please visit humanrestorationproject.org and click the support button. We're a nonprofit organization. Your donation's tax deductible. Today, we're joined by MANTRaP, which stands for Misogyny and the Red Pill. They're a group of researchers at Lancaster and Birmingham City universities investigating the language of the aforementioned Manosphere. And as a recent ninth grade teacher, I was just saying before we hopped on the call here, it's a lot for something like this. I'd say the vast majority of young boys in our class were at least familiar with folks like Andrew Tate. Steven Crowder is really big, and I know he's kind of moving into that space. And Nick and I, when we do professional development with Human Restoration Project, we find that especially middle school students are making some highly problematic and sexist comments in the context of, like in scare quotes here, acting like Andrew Tate. So all of that to say is that it's a really serious issue. Hopefully this session will help educators understand more about what to do in regards to it, how to find it, that kind of thing. And again, we appreciate you all joining us today. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to our presenters and we'll go from there.
Again, just to thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you to the organisers for inviting us. So we are the MANTRaP research team. Today is going to be in two parts. So we're going to start off by talking about some of our research into the Manosphere. And then in the second half, we're going to do some practical data analysis with you. So the first half, we're going to be talking about what the Manosphere is. So we'll be sharing, we'll be talking about what the Manosphere is and some of the important groups of the Manosphere. We'll talk about some of our research findings of the Manosphere, so the language that might be characteristic of the Manosphere as a whole, and then some of the language that might be characteristic of specific groups, such as incel language, perhaps. Then we'll be talking about why the Manosphere is a concern. So we'll be talking about how young people are influenced by the Manosphere, and what ways in which young people are impacted. And then we'll finish by talking about practical things, so how we can help to make young people less perceptible and what sort of linguistic features we can look out for. And then in the second half, we're going to do a data analysis activity where we'll be sharing some real Manosphere social media posts, and we'll be having a look at them together and thinking about if there's any sort of language that stands out as being offensive or extreme, and thinking about what we would do if you saw one of your students or perhaps other people you know that age making these sorts of posts. So who we are. So we are 4 researchers interested in gender and identity online, the construction of misogyny and sexism in online contexts, and we explore relevant online data using a variety of linguistic methods, some more quantitative and some more qualitative. So our team is made up of 4 researchers, getting myself. So there's me, I'm Jess Aston. I've just finished my PhD at Lancaster University, where I studied the Manosphere group known as MGTOW. Also Professor Veronica Collar, who is a Professor of Discourse Studies at Lancaster University. Dr. Alexandra Crendel, who has also recently finished her PhD on the Manosphere and is currently a researcher at Lancaster. And finally, Dr. Mark McGlashan, who is a senior lecturer in English language linguistics at Birmingham City University. So we've talked a bit about the Manosphere. We've mentioned this term a lot, but you might not know what it actually is. So the Manosphere is a loose network of a number of radical communities dedicated to discussion of issues related to men and masculinity. So by a loose network, we mean it's comprised of lots of different groups. It's not so much that people would log on to like www.manosphere.com or reddit.com/manosphere, but more a loose network of lots of smaller communities. So, and that is across social media. So we've got Twitter accounts, YouTube channels, subreddits, forums, and so on. These are forums and communities that are dominated by men and talk about issues related to men and masculinity. Much research into the Manosphere distinguishes about 4 major groups, some of which you might have heard of. So these include pick-up artists who share techniques for seducing women, And then on the flip side, we have men going their own way who advocate separatism and so argue that men should avoid women as much as possible. We also have men's rights activists and involuntary celibates, or incels. If you've heard of any of these groups, it's probably incels who you are the most likely to have heard of. And although these groups have different attitudes towards women, towards relationships with women, what's consistent across these forums is the legitimation of misogyny and through discussion of red pill philosophy. So the red pill is a metaphor taken from the science fiction film The Matrix. So in The Matrix, taking the red pill meant learning that, the world was a simulation and the world was run by machines. In the Manosphere, taking the red pill means learning the truth that it's men who are oppressed and it's feminists and women who have duped us into thinking otherwise. So in these groups, they disavow feminism and gender equality, and they argue that it's men who are oppressed and women who are the privileged ones in society. And these groups are becoming increasingly prevalent and increasingly popular on social media, and we also see them talked about more in the mainstream media as well. So what I'll do now is I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Alex, who is going to talk about some of our research.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm going to talk through some research findings here, based on some work that we've done looking at the language used across the Manosphere. So we've talked about, all of these different groups. So this is the stuff that all of them share and all of them talk about. So what we did was look at 5 Manosphere communities on Reddit, corresponding to the groups that Jess has just talked about. And we collected a corpus, which is basically a big database of texts of approximately 10.9 million words to see what they talk about and how they talk about it effectively. And we identified 5 prominent areas of meaning across the entire Manosphere. Perhaps unsurprisingly, one of these is sexuality and relationships. So words such as attraction and porn come up across all 5 groups. Also prevalent were references to thoughts and feelings, something that we're going to touch a little bit on later. Lots of intensifying language as well. So, assertions using language like, really and never and always and, this type of thing. There are also references to gendered social actor terms, people. So men, women, etc. And also physical and non-physical descriptors of these people. So, what they're like to look at and how they are as people. And it's really these last 2 that we're going to talk about in more detail. So cheers, Jess. Right, so we decided to look at how gendered social actors were represented, right? Because we were interested in how gender dynamics sort of conceptualized, talked about across the Manosphere. So what I've divided here is into how male social actors are discussed and female social actors. So firstly, our lads. So we've got some gender identification terms. So sort of men, guys, really, really general stuff. A couple of relational terms there as well. So boyfriend and BF. The one biological sex term, male. We also have one derogatory term in here, which is cuck, which is used within Manosphere groups to refer to lower status men, effectively imagining masculinity as a hierarchy with sort of independent alpha males at the top and men who are lower in status and, perhaps, have, different ideas about how they should talk to women and the relationships they should have with women are relegated to that space. There are also some kinship terms in there, so dude, bro, that sort of thing, and also some in-group terms for what people do and who they are. So terms like PUA, short for pickup artist, incel, neckbeard as well, so referring to the appearance of certain men as well, which wasn't like super common, but did come up across all 5, which is interesting. As well as a reference to another subreddit, Nice Guys. So that's our male social actors. Now on to the women. You may very well have noticed that there is one category in this column that is a lot larger than in the male social actors category. So first off, there's our gender identification terms. So this is, our general stuff, women, girls, that sort of thing. And it should be noted that the gender identification terms were absolutely the most common. But next, we've got a few more relational terms in there. So we've got girlfriend, but also girlfriends, GF, and also lesbian. Biological sex terms, female, females, and then a whole host of derogatory terms for women, which I'll allow you to read at your own leisure. So having done this study, we decided to look at the 4 most frequent terms, which were men, women, girls, and guys, to look at the words that surround them, to say, okay, so clearly men, women, girls, and guys are talked about a lot in the manosphere, but how exactly are they talked about? So one of the first things we found was that these social actors were homogenized and essentialized. So there are discussions around all men, all women, words like most, many, majority, lots. Okay, so talking in sort of, really, really broad terms. And there are also references to innate qualities as well. So words like naturally come up, co-occurring with women. So one example from the data is women naturally have much higher standards than men. So statements like that were really quite common. Another thing that we noted was that differences between male and female social actors were emphasized via comparatives. So words such as higher and less and more were used to draw comparisons between men and women. So an example would be women tend to earn higher grades and drop out less frequently than men. So talking about men and women's differences in education. Some interesting terms as well that came up on comparatives were okay and easier, which express the way commenters see women as being treated in wider society. So there's one example that's it's way easier to be a woman in the United States in 2018. And what's really interesting about that is that easier comes up as co-occurring with women and hard co-occurs with men. To talk about the inverse, to say it's really difficult being a man. Men have an incredibly hard time getting support. So, there are these strong comparisons drawn there. We also found that women are represented as having more power than men, being capable of violence against men, and women in society passivating men. So what we mean by passivating here is that in the data we found constructions like women blame men, society blame men, women hate men, society hate men, for this, that, and the other. And interestingly, although capable came up as something that was, attributed to women, it's not necessarily in a good way. So we saw capable and thought, oh, okay, this this is interesting, potentially feminist reading. No, when women are described as capable in these contexts, it's of something negative against men. So being capable of domestic violence, for example. Something else we noted is that women and girls were objectified and passive in dating and sexual context. So they're described in terms of physical appearance, pretty, hot, fat, attractive, and, in the sort of object space. So, having things done to them in this context rather than being more sort of powerful and more agentive. When women are more sort of, agentive, when it's the women doing things, it's not so much doing, it's more thinking and feeling. So there's a lot of talk about what women love, want, like, and think, but not so much about what they do. Interestingly, successful as well came up for both the men and the women, but for women it's talking about how to be successful with women, how to get women into bed, but for men it's about being successful in a career. So it's interesting to note how even though the same word can come up, it can be used in a vastly different context. It should be noted that violence against women was acknowledged in the Manosphere data that we looked at, but the perceived grievances of women were downplayed in favor of men. So even though, violence against women is acknowledged, women are equally capable of violence against men. And words like complain and choose, so women complain, women choose, are used to dismiss grievances like women not getting into STEM, that objectification isn't necessarily a real issue. So one of the examples from the data is women still don't choose STEM careers. So, when women, do have power in something, it's something, it's not necessarily a positive thing. And then lastly, women are framed as lying about sexual assault. And so, that's something that comes across all areas of the manosphere. So, saying, women do lie, and this is why and how. So this is the language that brings the manosphere together. But now Mark is going to talk for a little bit about the language that is unique to each of these groups. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Alex. So yeah, we kind of did some work. So we did do some work. You'll see the link below to the paper that is coming out shortly. That is sort of the inverse method. So rather than looking at things that are shared across the whole manosphere, you'll notice that this little Venn diagram at the top. We were really interested in these linguistic features that are idiosyncratic to each of these communities, and a lot of those discourses that Alex was talking about just then come up as really interesting. I say interesting in inverted commas. Expressions of these kind of discourses that are community specific. So you'll see the 5 communities on the left here. So incels, men's rights, men's rights activists, MGTOW. Incels, they talk about involuntary celibates. They're all about living a life that is living a life of misery because they can't attract women, or they have sexual desires which aren't fulfilled in some way or other. And that becomes instantiated, or it becomes relevant through these community-specific racialized discourses. So this JBW acronym means just be white. So the most attractive you can be is by being white. And so I'm sure you've read some things about incels already, but this kind of tiering of what it means to be attractive, this kind of pseudoscience around what it means to be attractive, being white is seen as one of these things that if you tick the box, that makes you instantly more attractive than somebody who comes from India, where they talk about people being as curry cells, or Chang, which is you can be, so you'll have heard this word Chad, the alpha expression of being masculine, white, this kind of ideal body that there is. A Chang is an Asian Chad, but can never be as attractive as a Chad because he's not white. And so it becomes racialized and talked about in this way, in terms of desire, in this really horrible racist way. And people become codified into these like social categories based on race. Obviously that comes paired with things to do with mental health and suicide. So you'll probably have a bit of a health one at the beginning of this talk, but things about denial and these stuff to do with thoughts and feelings and emotional expressions in incel groups revolves around mental health issues, suicide. There are many more terms than this, but you'll see things like people being autists, and they talk about autism or being on some kind of spectrum, but also talking quite explicitly about suicidal ideation. And these are words. So all these words that are listed here are things that come up as specifically salient and unique to these groups. So they kind of act as linguistic identifiers of being a member of those groups. Same with men's rights activists. So you'll see that there's some themes here about crime, punishment, political activism, and genitals, which is quite interesting. Picking up again off some of those themes that Alex was talking about. A lot of talk about crime and punishment is about women and how women are the problems in society. So when we talk about paedophiles, or when men's rights activists talk about paedophiles, they talk about women who have groomed a younger boy, who the conversation usually goes, if this happened with a man, they would be called a paedophile. But because it was a woman who groomed a younger boy, they are not called a paedophile by the media, and they are also a predator. And like they say, well, it's one rule for men who are paedophiles or predators, but women aren't labeled the same way. So that's how the conversation usually goes. They talk about punishments and sentences and punishment. So men are seen as being punished by a system around things like, so you talk about it in America as alimony. So things to do with like justice for fathers who have been as a result of divorce. Are they penalised for wanting to be fathers? Is the system there to prop up women, and men are again the losers? So then that leads on to things like advocacy, political activism. They like suffragettes because they were seen as, well, they're all for equality as well, but the kind of equality that we've got now is not the right kind of equality, and we need to get back to some kind of ideal of equality. And then that becomes really, really distilled in this kind of zero-sum game where women aren't treated the same as men. So the conversation around female genital mutilation, for example, isn't talked about in the same way with circumcision of young boys and men. So we get circumcision, genitals, and mutilation as, well, this is genital mutilation and it happens to men and it happens on a wide scale. And it's a very American or North American specific kind of discourse on the treatment of male genitals. But it's why isn't that called genital mutilation when female genital mutilation is such a problem? Why are men treated in this way? So that's men's rights activists. When we talk about men going their own way, we find, again, talk about there's a lot of talk about gold diggers. So the reason why men want to go their own way is because women are gold diggers and leeches who want to basically strip away your financial independence. So the way to become independent and get away from everything and go your own way is to become financially independent, planning for retirement, investing in crypto, not taking on debt, and also getting rid of women. And one way of doing that is through sexual technology, using sex bots and sex dolls. So replacing women with what they're all only useful for anyway, in what men going their own way believe is the only thing that they're useful for. So they drain your money and they're just there for sex anyway. So why don't we just solve the problems that way? I'm re-articulating. I'm not saying this from my point of view. This is just what comes out of the data. Pickup artists. So we get, again, obviously the focus of this community is to do with, again, you'll have noticed already, incels, men's rights activists, and men going their own way. All the problems that are coming up are because of women. Pickup artists. The problem here with women is not being able to access sex or not being able to form relationships in a particular way. And so the way that they talk about women is in how to pick them up. So these methods, so they talk about techniques and routines, some kind of abracadabra spell that you can tell to, I don't know, you do these three things and a woman will be fawning over you. Often that involves some kind of emotional manipulation or blackmail or some kind of strange technique that involves, so you'll see this word here, negs. So this negative complimenting, basically wear down a woman's self-esteem in order to get her to do what you want her to do. And again, these are all specific words that become that are indicative of what it means to be part of these communities. So we see behaviors that are seen as good behaviors in order to pick women up. So you want to tease women, chatting is a good thing, complimenting, smiling, eye contact, tonality. These are all things that you should be conscious of if you want to get a woman into bed. But obviously this is these all seem like nice things, but how they're used is, yeah, it's a strange old world, pickup artistry. And the final one here is the red pill. So the red pill is this framing community. So this underpinning foundational community where a lot of the philosophy is talked about and organized, which is then expressed in idiosyncratic ways in these other groups. So you find in the red pill that relationships is still a core idea. And you'll see some of these acronyms here. So you see LTR, which means long-term relationship, ONS, which is one night stand, and SMP, which is sexual marketplace. And this is really, these are really interesting, really indicative ways in which, well, basically heteronormative relationships are thought about across all these communities. So long-term relationships and one night stands, like all relationships are going to be on one of these kind of scales. And this sexual marketplace. So we don't just exist as humans who might want to interact, and I don't know, life is a bit more messy than having these techniques and spells to get each other to do what we want them to do. Like we have a sexual marketplace, everybody has a value. Somebody's a 10, somebody's a 1. There's something more attractive. Being white puts you up there. So like how these things are expressed is really interesting. And it turns into how then people are talked about within the sexual marketplace is as objects. And this objectifies both the community members, so men who are wanting to, I don't know, become part of or dominate or something the sexual marketplace, but also women who are seen as the object of this desire, and they get turned into plates. And you spin plates, and you can spin as many plates as you want, but at some point it doesn't really matter because they're a plate and you can break them. If you break a plate, it doesn't matter. And on the sexual marketplace, it doesn't matter if you're a loser because it's competition. This is capitalist market principles. Whoever wins is the winner, and that's it. And so yeah, you can next. Women are nexted. So if they show you disrespect, next. If they don't do exactly what you want, next. And I'll come on to some of these community influencers like Fresh and Fifth, for example. So this idea, okay, you're talking over me. Next, go away, get out of my sight. And commitment and diggers. So these gold diggers, and this is what women are, like relationships of commitment, and women are gold diggers. So be aware of that. Diet and exercise. So I'm probably taking up a bit too much time here. Diet and exercise becomes a big thing. Participating in the sexual marketplace, you need to be a big alpha male, buff dude. Philosophy and education. So there's a big talk. There's also talk about like what it means to think about be a stoicist, for example. And mastering yourself, and then these community figureheads who I'll talk about in a second. So Rollo Tomasi, Pook, Roosh, and Glow. These are people who are important figureheads. Yes, next slide, please. Sorry, I'll go rush through these next slides quickly. So we've talked about these groups in the manosphere. We've got involuntary celibates, and these slides will be distributed so you can use them in your own time. So just like all other groups, blame women of feminism for not wanting, for not doing. And not allowing them to participate in the sexual marketplace, so they want to have relationships with women but can't. Men go on their own way. Argue that men should seek to avoid women as much as possible. They see men and women as homogeneous groups. I'm probably going to have to get my son in a second. Homogeneous groups in which there should be a stark division. Next slide, sorry. Yeah, and then we've got these red pill communities. So they can frame themselves as self-help communities where you better yourself. And there are ways to engage in the sexual marketplace, especially, and ways to become the master that. Sorry, you probably heard my son crying. Finally, pickup artists. So again, these will be distributed. I'm going to pass it on in a second.
Yeah. Do you want me to take over, Mark, so you can
yes, please.
attend to
please.
Frank? Good. Okay.
Thank you.
So important point here that these communities, some of them can really seem like self-help communities. Incels as well can just seem like a support group to people, really. The pickup artists, we've already said who they are, and some of the, including linguistic routines they engage in. Some of these self-styled pickup artists have been prosecuted for stalking, at least in Britain. And they've recently rebranded themselves as so-called lifestyle coaches, perhaps in an attempt to detoxify themselves. Next slide, please, Jess. Right, so then how do young people find the manosphere? Much too easily. So there are, of course, specific websites like Incels.is or something like that. And we know that the traffic to those increased massively between 2019 and 2020, so an effect of the pandemic and people being online in their bedrooms. For instance, for men's rights, subscriber doubled within 4 years. For the pickup artist, it even tripled. Again, very much a pandemic effect. There are particular social media platforms where people are more likely to find manosphere content than others. So Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, the latter especially for pickup artists and separatists. And of course, these media platforms also attract people of a younger or slightly less young age. Reddit is a big one. Some subreddits have actually been banned. So they've first been quarantined and then banned. So the incel and separatist subreddits, because of actively advocating for violence against women. Worryingly, a lot of manosphere content is leaking into gaming communities a lot. There are also influences on YouTube, which are almost a bit on the margins of the manosphere. So like Alpha M, for instance, standing for alpha male, who doesn't do the most extreme misogynistic content, but it's sort of a slightly toned down version, but definitely coming from the manosphere. And of course, on YouTube, in particular, perhaps you have radicalization due to the algorithm. So you've watched perhaps something relatively harmless by Alpha M, and then the algorithm will push this into your feed, really. We know that happens. Next slide, please. So what the manosphere does once people get in touch with it is that it influences young people's beliefs about feminism. So there's a charity or a charitable trust in Britain that's called Hope Not Hate. That has produced quite a few surveys and reports. And they have found, for instance, that half of young men aged 16 to 24 believe that feminism makes it more difficult for men to succeed in the world. This is from 2020. It's also teachers like yourself report that they repeat manosphere talking points in school. When challenged, they get aggressive, they harass female students and teachers. As I said, reacting with aggression and denial, also trying to silence others, shouting them down in the classroom. Don't know if you've experienced that. A more recent survey by the same charity, Hope Not Hate, from earlier this year, looked at the profile of Andrew Tate, who has already been mentioned, and found that 79% of 16 or 17-year-old boys have engaged with his content in one way or another, and that over half of them have a positive view of him. In the same age group, girls, only 1% have a positive view of him. For the American context, the Southern Poverty Law Center last year also looked at political affiliation and said that, found that just under half of Democrat men, or Democrat voters, under 50, believe that feminism has done more harm than good. And that only goes for less than a quarter of women voters for the Democrats on the same age. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what should those who have to care, teach, interact with young people look out for in language? Of course, there are specific phrases and acronyms, and we've mentioned quite a few already. So we've mentioned red pill, and the opposite of that is blue pill, again, going back to a pivotal scene in the Matrix movie. So blue pill would be, you haven't taken the red pill, you live in blissful ignorance. Alpha male or Chad, so that is what sometimes in academic circles is known as hegemonic masculinity. So the best possible way of being a man, according to the manosphere people. That's in contrast with beta male or cuck. So somebody who has taken the blue pill, somebody who is inferior, also a man who defends women, or interestingly, especially in a US context, a cuck can also be somebody who has liberal politics. It's an interesting word, ultimately comes from the bird cuckoo, but I don't have time to go into this here now. So yeah, it's also, cuck is also a word that you find in far-right nationalist circles. Then incels in particular use a word called femoid or foid. That's short for female humanoid. So the idea that women are robots, that came up in the chat already, this dehumanization. Specific acronyms such as all women are like that. So that speaks to these homogenizing statements. So women are and men are one undifferentiated group, women in particular, and it's totalizing. All of them are like that. Incels sometimes use LDAR, lay down and rot. So that is to do with what somebody in the chat mentioned, the black pill. So the defeatist attitude, we're doomed, we are unattractive, we can never get out of it. That can then actually escalate to suicidal ideation. So, and this is where young men can get really at risk of, well, harming others, but perhaps more pertinently harming themselves. And then we've listed a couple of miscellaneous terms. Don't have time to explain them now. They're not very pleasant, but we can elaborate on them if you want to. Important point, though, is that it's not just individual words. So it's also these exaggerated generalizing statements, these intensifiers, these all women on always and never. Obsessive comparisons between men and women, up to the point where men and women are almost talked about as if they were different species, or women are a non-human species. So there's also more complex things where you may not find any of these alarm bell words, but you do get a certain kind of discourse, a kind of way of talking about gender. So what can we do to make young people less perceptible? So Manosphere beliefs don't exist in a vacuum, and nor, unfortunately, do they stay in a vacuum. So exaggerate mainstream thoughts about gender and sexuality. So an important antidote here is having really early conversations about healthy relationships and gender relations. In Britain, this is actually a part of the curriculum. I know that in America it can probably differ a lot from state to state. Constructive support with difficult feelings around girls' sexuality and masculinity, opening up spaces where boys can talk about these feelings without being afraid of losing face or laughed at or teased. Supportive friendships. So these are all sort of, in inverted commas, soft factors. Mark and Alex have recently done some work with an IT company about blocking software that is used at schools for safeguarding. They can elaborate on that. And yeah, talk to your IT staff. What is in place for the school in terms of software for online safeguarding, blocking particular websites, etc. And again, also teaching digital media literacy, so that people know if they encounter a typical trope or content from the manosphere, how to respond, how to look at it critically. Now, for the last bit, I pass over to Jessica.
Okay, so thank you. This was just an overview of some of the research that we've done. Here are some of the references that we have used. So what we're going to do for the last 20 minutes is we have a practical activity. So we're going to share with you some examples of Manosphere posts. Most of them are from Twitter. There's some memes, some videos, and some tweets. I'm going to share the link in a Google Drive. Hopefully that will work. And what we're going to do is we'd like us to have a look at the 6 social media posts. And if we can have about 10 minutes to look at them individually and share your thoughts in the chat as you have them. And then after about 10 minutes, we'll have a bigger group discussion of the 6 posts. So we've come up with some example questions that you could think about when you're looking at the posts, such as, can you identify any Manosphere specific language or arguments? So this could be any of the terms that we've talked about before, or any that maybe strike you as being sexist in some way. How offensive you think each example is, and how would you rank them? So that any that maybe seem more benign or any that seem really offensive. And also thinking about what would you do if some of your students were making or sharing these posts online, or if they were using some of this language in the classroom. What would you say? How would you intervene? And if so, what would you do?
Who controls access to sex, men or women?
Women.
Yeah, woman.
Women, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say hookup culture, if we want to see hookup culture stop, because women kind of control when sex happens. So do you have anyone to blame but yourselves on that one? Do you know? Thoughts? Okay, crickets, here we go. Okay, so, and also,
we've already had a lot of really interesting discussion in the chat, thinking about factors such as the amount of followers and views these tweets have, the impact of the Twitter blue check, for the possibility of bots. Is it sad that I've seen all of these? Oh dear. Yes, when I was collecting examples, I was trying to prioritize things that had been went viral quite recently, and things that sort of were promoted on my feeds and not, which was quite interesting. So would anyone like to, if you have any thoughts on any of these texts and would like to share them off mute, please do so.
Can I unmute and speak? Is this the
Yeah.
point? Sorry, I was looking at the chat. I think it's interesting because like I don't have the cultural context to decode the Sophie Turner one. It's entirely lost on me. But I noticed that that image has 13.1 million views, and I just don't even understand what the message is, who these people are, what I'm supposed to be mad about. But clearly, it's context here in this collection, and then from the MGTOW account that it's tweeting from, I'm clearly supposed to be mad at it, but I don't have the cultural capital to unpack it. So I think that's what's interesting, is it's like an appeal to some kind of in-group mentality, or something that as an outsider, I may not be aware of, but as someone in the in-group, you might have the understanding and the knowledge to be upset about Sophie Turner for some reason.
Yeah, what's very interesting about these is there's some Manosphere posts you see, and I imagine them being completely impenetrable to someone who's not been in these spaces for so long. And then there's other posts that they try and make the same point, but they don't use all of this language. What the Sophie Turner example is saying is that in the Manosphere, they often talk about women hitting the wall. So what this means is when women hit a certain age, usually in their mid-20s or mid-30s, they become suddenly a lot less attractive to men, and so they decline in their attractiveness. Sometimes they also talk about women being less fertile. And so this can be used to normalize some really problematic ideas, which is that women are the most attractive and are the best at having children when they're like in their early 20s or even younger. So what they're saying here is that, oh, Sophie Turner, even though she's only 27, she's already hit the wall. And, what do you want us to do with this information? Because it's posted by MGTOW, maybe the implication is that, look, why would you want to be with a woman if she's going to turn ugly by the time she's 27?
I was just thinking about the restaurant meme, and how in the times that I've heard boys in my classroom talk about Andrew Tate, and I didn't know who Andrew Tate was until like mid-year, because I'm 40 and I don't know how to use TikTok. But but when they talked about him, I wasn't concerned at first, because it seems like 9 out of 10 of the things he was saying were things like, hey, it's great to be healthy and address your mental health and your physical health. And those 9 things that they say, like, it's really nice to take a woman to a restaurant and it's nice to know what you want. They seem sort of like very harmless until like the 10th thing is said, and it's all women's fault. It's why you're not having. So I just think it's so interesting. Because I'm sort of checked out, I have 2 girls at home, like I'm not often seeing this type of social media within my own household. I just wonder how often parents are, I wonder how we can educate parents about making them more aware of what their children are ingesting, because I know that I've talked to a lot of, parents who didn't know who Andrew Tate was either, but they were pleased to see their young, 11-year-old boy go outside for the first time in ages and start working out instead of, playing video games. So I think it seems like parents don't know how dangerous these things are. I mean, I didn't as a teacher until I started looking more into it.
Yeah, a lot of, as we said in our presentation, a lot of these manosphere communities do try and present themselves as self-help or self-improvement advice. I think the restaurant text is a really good example of that. Talks about, advice for men to be confident, and here's how to, to take a woman out on a date. And so you can imagine some men might follow these accounts to try and get some dating advice, but obviously then we see that the advice given is very much about being controlling towards women. Like, some of the language, it says your woman as well. Also, people in the chat have been saying that they've been talking about the video clip and the possible offensiveness of that being in how it's sort of framed to like try and catch the women out as well. I want to talk about, did anyone spot any particular language instances that they thought were quite sexist or maybe quite characteristic of the manosphere?
We already had the thing about hitting the wall, so that's a common trope, right?
Is there an appeal to? I'm looking at the serial killer one because I've kind of noticed this return of like a phrenology sort of idea. Maybe that comes out in the Chad culture. Maybe it comes out in some of these other parts where, like your phenotype is like expressive of virtue and all those kinds of things. Just kind of these really gross, almost eugenic kind of ideas expressed in that image. Psychopath, criminal, ugly. Psychopath, criminal, handsome. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of pseudoscience in the manosphere, right? That they then use to own women or catch them out. So a lot about evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, eugenics, obviously, with obvious links to the far right, historically and in the present day. So there's a lot of that going on, a lot of half-digested science that is used to make a particular point.
And what you also get in incel communities is they talk a lot about specific facial features that they think make them unattractive to women. And they can get very specific. So talking about, women don't want me because I have really tiny wrists.
Just going to chip in there as well. Again, how those pseudo-scientific ideas are expressed in different communities in different ways. So you'll have seen a lot about the Liver King recently, and this connection with an ancestral history is done through eating livers or internal organs of animals, and that will give you some kind of ancestral strength. And so the heart of the thing that you want to be like, which is this really ancient thinking. But then also you get the flip side of it, where you'll see talk about tarot cards and crystals and star signs as being linked to feminists and women, and they're feminine kinds of pseudoscience, and they're all bad. So you see like this weird characterization of women as being into crystals, and then they'll disregard you because you're not a Leo or something like that, when they're doing exactly the same thing but in a different way.
There's one big question, and we're running out of time, we're aware of that, but one big question is how to intervene. If you have students in the classroom who are meant, for instance, to do a group work activity, and you see them suddenly looking at that, what you do? Right? And I know that you don't have the answer to this now, and nor do we, but that is what follows from this. Well, how do you engage? And there was a question in the chat, without them just doubling down or giggling or whatever.
I would ask them to explain what it means. Ask questions rather than preach, such as, so what is this? What does it mean? Why is it important? How are we supposed to react?
Yeah, also maybe, do you have a guttural reaction to that? Noticing, is there an immediate emotional component to a reaction? Like, do you think you got baited into that, maybe, or I don't know if that would be provoking oh, you're just out of touch adult type of response, maybe, but something like that.
I think especially with the things like the hookup culture video, we could ask about, you might feel angry at the women's response. You might think, well, how has the video creator made you feel that way? Like, how has the video been organized and set up in order to make the women seem, stupid or hypocritical, and why it makes you angrier at them? Other people have said they would ask questions such as, have you considered the possibility there might be other perspectives? Have you considered the feelings that might drive your reactions? What does it mean to hit the wall? What's wrong with her surgery? How has pregnancy made her ugly? Yes, I think a lot of people saying asking sort of questions to make people think more critically about the topic, rather than immediately shutting down, saying, oh, rather than trying to immediately shut people down for posting something like this or sharing something like this, making them think more critically about why they're sharing it, what problematic assumptions could follow on from these sorts of posts. So trying to make people think a bit more critically.
Yeah, also important point, also talk about with young women as well, because obviously it has direct repercussions on them. So to, have some counteraction against that content that they may hear filtered through their male peers.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time when we're talking about the manosphere, we talk a lot about how can we protect young boys, and we also need to remember that it's not just boys who are affected. If girls are always hearing their male classmates repeating Andrew Tate and Manosphere talk, and this, could affect their self-esteem. And so we need to, also be saying to girls that these things aren't true, and also, stand up for the girls in your classroom if people are saying sexist things to them as a result of being in these spaces. I'm aware that we are over the hour.
As we kind of approach the end here, what recommendations do you have for folks? Like, what resources could they look to? Are there certain websites or content that you all have that for folks that want to learn more they could find?
So we have, sorry, go ahead, Jess.
I was just going to say that you and Mark did something, so I was going to invite you to talk about it.
Yes, so we can share with you certainly links to, we have an FAQ that we've developed after a similar event with British teachers. And Jess has written a fantastic article or blog post that's called What is the Manosphere and Why is it a Concern? Just like the title of this presentation. So that's really it in a nutshell as well. So Chris, we certainly can send you some links to further materials.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. And thank you so much for sharing this. I think it was super informative, super important topic, and appreciate everybody here participating in this and talking about this at it's a rough conversation, but it's a conversation we have to be having because it's something that it seems like virtually every young person is encountering in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, we appreciate the presentation. A recording of this will be made available after this. We'll publish it later today with the slides and any additional resources in the show notes. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you again for MANTRaP for presenting. We appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for everyone for listening. And we've had some really interesting discussion in the chat. It's been hard to keep up with all of it, but there's been some really interesting points being made. So thank you all for engaging with what we've been speaking about.
Well, thank you again, everybody. Have a nice long weekend if you're in the States, and we'll talk again soon. All right. Good luck out there. Have a good one. See ya.
We are up against the challenge of being solitary educators, alone on an island. What we have to do is fight against that tide and keep the lights on of our community.
The more you see the joy of the children and their happiness and how engaged they are, the more you're going to start questioning whether what you're doing is actually the right thing to do.
We need to make clear that all education is a struggle over identities, it's a struggle over agency, it's a struggle over hope, and it's a struggle over the future. So don't give up hope. Fight as hard as you can.
Showing them that we understand them, that we're on the same level, like getting to know them better, them getting to know us. We're kind of on the same eye level. Like, yeah, they understand me.
Conflict is a day-to-day reality. What we're trying to do is we're trying to not let every conflict be the reason for relationships to shatter.
Needs should be addressed in restorative justice, and offenders should be encouraged to take responsibility so that harm can be repaired.
And all the familiar things you see about mathematics in terms of balance and hanger tree diagrams, that's all there. But what has never been there before was the narrative.
It's so critical that we don't lose the ethos and the soul of the movement.